Welcome back to Lore at Night, where rain gently falls and every story carries a shadow. I'm always curious to hear where in the world you're listening from, so comment that down below. Now get comfortable, and let's begin with the first story. The first sign that something was wrong was not a scream or a gunshot. It was a garage door left half open on a calm Tuesday morning in late October, the kind of oversight that did not fit the neighborhood's habits. At 7:18 a.m., a dog walker cut across a cul-de-sac and saw the opening, a black wedge of shadow beneath pale stucco. The security light was still on, even though the sun had already begun to rinse the desert gold. He hesitated, called out once, then did what most people do when they sense they are nearing the edge of someone else's private catastrophe. He backed away and called 911. Patrol arrived within minutes. The garage smelled faintly of gasoline and hot rubber, as if a car had been pulled in too fast. A silver SUV sat inside, parked crooked, driver's door shut. The house door from the garage to the kitchen stood open. Nothing inside looked torn apart. The counters were clean, a coffee mug left by the sink, a tablet face down as if it had been set aside mid-thought. The stillness was precise, curated, and that was what made it unsettling. They found Marissa Cole in the downstairs office. She was 41, the chief financial officer of a regional medical supply company, known for her blunt competence and the quiet authority that made meetings move faster. She lay on her side near the desk, one arm bent awkwardly beneath her. Blood had pooled darkly into the carpet, already drying at the edges. The injury was to the back of her head, consistent with blunt force, delivered with enough strength to drop her quickly. There were no defensive wounds visible at first glance, no signs of prolonged struggle. The office window was closed. The blinds were half drawn, letting in a narrow slice of desert light. The first responding officers stepped back and sealed the house. Investigators from Homicide and Crime Scene arrived to read the space like a document. The desk held a leather planner, neatly written entries for the week, and a stack of printed financial reports with corners aligned. A small safe was built into the wall behind a framed photograph of the desert after rain. The safe door was open. Inside, the shelves were empty except for a single velvet pouch. The pouch held nothing. In the kitchen, a bowl of lemons sat on the counter like a stage detail, too bright for the mood that filled the rooms. The refrigerator held fresh groceries. The trash contained only dry waste. No torn papers, no signs of hasty cleanup. Upstairs, the bedroom was made, linens smoothed. Marissa's closet contained most of her clothing. Her passport was still in a drawer. Her wedding ring, though she had been divorced for 2 years, rested on a small dish beside the bed. Outside, footprints in the gravel showed no obvious pattern, but the desert ground is deceptive. It holds impressions, then erases them under the light wind that moves through the saguaros. The property's security system was intact, but the panel in the hallway showed it had been disarmed at 6:03 a.m., then never rearmed. That fact implied familiarity. Either Marissa had turned it off herself, or someone with her code had. Detectives began the initial interviews in the street, keeping voices low while the forensics team worked inside. Neighbors described Marissa as private, but not isolated. She ran early, drove herself to work, and kept her social life small. She had ended her marriage cleanly, according to those who knew the story, and focused hard on her career. A coworker said she had been tense lately, distracted in a way that did not match her usual control. Another mentioned a recent internal audit that had stirred discomfort in the accounting department, though no one spoke openly about it. By afternoon, the medical examiner estimated time of death between 5:30 and 6:30 a.m. That window narrowed the suspect pool to anyone who could move through the foothills before the morning traffic. anyone who knew the roads that looped behind the ridge, anyone who could enter the house without forcing a door. Then the lab technician called the lead detective back into the office, pointing to something small near the baseboard. Beneath the desk, tucked into the shadow where vacuum cleaners rarely reach, was a single pale green nitrile glove fingertip, cleanly torn as if it had snagged on a nail or a rough edge at the wrong moment. It was the first hint that whoever did this had come prepared, and it suggested a kind of calm that did not belong in a home at dawn. The investigation expanded outward from the house in measured rings, beginning with those who had access and moving slowly toward those who might have motive. The Catalina foothills offered beauty and privacy in equal measure, a place where winding roads and gated drives made anonymity easier than it appeared. Detectives understood quickly that the geography favored someone who planned their movements carefully. Marissa Cole's phone was recovered from the kitchen counter, plugged in and fully charged. Its contents suggested an orderly life until the moment it stopped. Messages from coworkers referenced routine matters, budget approvals, a reminder about a board call scheduled for later that morning. There were no incoming calls or texts between midnight and the estimated time of death. Her calendar showed nothing out of the ordinary. Silence again became a presence, pointing not toward chaos, but toward interruption. The glove fragment discovered beneath the desk was sent to the lab, along with fibers lifted from the carpet and the back of Marissa's blouse. The blow that killed her had been delivered from behind, slightly above the ear, consistent with someone standing close, possibly someone she had allowed into the room. The absence of overturned furniture or broken objects suggested she had not expected violence. Investigators noted the desk chair was pushed in neatly, as if she had stood up or leaned forward before the strike. Attention returned to the safe. Its digital lock showed no signs of tampering. Entry logs confirmed it had been opened at 6:01 a.m., 2 minutes before the security system was disarmed. Whatever had been inside was taken deliberately, then the door left open. The velvet pouch implied something small and valuable, but not jewelry. Financial documents were considered, but Marissa kept most sensitive material digitally secured. Detectives began to suspect data storage, something portable and easily concealed. At her office in downtown Tucson, investigators conducted interviews under the hum of fluorescent lights and unspoken anxiety. The internal audit mentioned by coworkers had focused on procurement contracts, a routine review that had nonetheless uncovered irregularities. Marissa had flagged several transactions involving a third-party distributor, payments that did not align cleanly with delivery records. The amounts were not massive, but they were repeated, a pattern that suggested intention rather than error. One name surfaced repeatedly in accounting emails, a senior operations manager who had approved the contracts. His explanations, documented in writing, were technically sufficient but thin. When detectives spoke to him, he appeared cooperative, though strained. He admitted Marissa had asked for additional documentation late the previous week and had scheduled a private meeting for the following Monday. He denied being at her house and provided an alibi supported by his spouse and home security footage. Investigators widened the net. Marissa's ex-husband was cleared quickly. His phone records placed him in another state overnight, and there was no history of violence or lingering financial entanglement. Friends described Marissa as cautious in her personal relationships, unlikely to meet someone at home early in the morning without a clear reason. That narrowed the field again, back toward professional contacts. Traffic cameras along the foothills roads were reviewed frame by frame. At 5:47 a.m., a dark sedan passed an intersection less than a mile from Marissa's house, heading uphill rather than toward the main arterial roads. The license plate was obscured by glare, but the timing aligned with the estimated window. A second camera captured the same vehicle leaving the area at 6:12 a.m., moving faster, the morning light just beginning to reveal color. It was not proof, but it was rhythm, a movement that fit the sequence inside the house. The lab results added texture without resolution. The glove fragment matched a common brand sold in bulk. No unique identifiers. A partial palm print lifted from the safe door did not belong to Marissa, but it was too incomplete to run conclusively. Fibers on her clothing suggested contact with a synthetic jacket, dark-colored, the kind worn by commuters and professionals alike. By the end of the second week, the case had taken on a quiet intensity. There was no public spectacle, no immediate suspect to satisfy the need for explanation. Instead, there was a growing sense that the murder had been precise, bounded by time and purpose. Someone had come to Marissa Cole's house before dawn, accessed her safe, and silenced her when she stood between them and whatever she had taken. What remained unclear was whether the killing had been the goal, or a decision made when control slipped for just a moment. By the third month, the investigation had narrowed to a small set of possibilities, not through dramatic discovery, but through subtraction. Each cleared lead reduced the noise and made the remaining signals harder to ignore. Detectives returned repeatedly to the timing, the order of actions inside the house, and the psychology implied by them. The killer had not rushed. They had opened the safe, taken the item, then remained long enough to confront Marissa in her office. That sequence suggested confidence and a belief that time was available. Forensic accountants were brought in to re-examine the procurement irregularities. What initially appeared modest in scale grew more troubling when traced laterally. The same distributor appeared across multiple subsidiaries, each time just below thresholds that would trigger automatic review. The pattern pointed toward a siphoning operation, designed to blend into routine expense flow. Marissa's notes, recovered from her work tablet, showed she had begun to map these transactions visually, drawing connections that were not obvious in spreadsheets alone. Investigators inferred that the missing item from the safe was likely a data drive. Marissa had been known to keep redundant backups offline, a habit formed early in her career after a server failure cost her weeks of work. A small encrypted drive would fit the velvet pouch and explain why digital systems showed no unusual access. It also explained why the killer had not searched the house more broadly. They knew exactly what they were there to retrieve. Attention returned to the dark sedan captured on camera. Analysts enhanced the footage, isolating minor details. A roof rack shadow, a distinctive pattern of brake light illumination. It narrowed the possibilities to a handful of models common among mid-level executives and consultants. Cross-referenced with employee vehicle registrations, one match stood out. A sedan owned by a compliance contractor who had worked with Marissa during earlier audits. The contractor, Daniel Price, was not initially on the radar. He was external, rotated between firms, and had legitimate access to sensitive information. His role placed him adjacent to Marissa's work without embedding him in office politics. When detectives interviewed him, his demeanor was controlled, cooperative in a way that felt rehearsed. He acknowledged knowing Marissa well professionally and admitted she had asked him to review historical compliance data shortly before her death. His alibi hinged on a late-night drive, a claim that placed him on a remote stretch of highway during the critical hours. There was no immediate contradiction, but the story lacked texture. When investigators requested access to his vehicle for a voluntary inspection, he hesitated before agreeing. Inside the trunk, beneath a folded tarp, they found traces of fine desert grit and a single nitrile glove, its fingertip torn away. The lab comparison was careful and conservative. The glove material matched the fragment found beneath Marissa's desk. It was not definitive on its own, but combined with the vehicle match and the professional overlap, it shifted the case. Detectives obtained a warrant to search Price's home office. There, hidden inside a hollowed technical manual, they found an encrypted drive. Breaking the encryption took weeks. When analysts succeeded, the contents confirmed Marissa's suspicions and extended them. The drive held transaction maps, internal emails, and draft reports documenting a fraud scheme that implicated multiple parties, including Price himself as a facilitator who ensured audits stayed superficial. The files were time-stamped, showing Marissa had finalized them the night before her death. The remaining question was motive at the moment of violence. Investigators reconstructed the likely encounter. Price had arrived early, intending to retrieve the drive quietly. Marissa, already awake and preparing for work, had confronted him in her office, possibly believing she could manage the situation through authority and evidence. The blow had come from behind, a decision made in seconds, irreversible once taken. As detectives prepared the arrest, they understood that the case had never been about rage or personal grievance. It had been about containment, about preventing exposure. The calm inside the house, the lack of chaos, reflected a mindset focused on outcome rather than emotion. What awaited in the final phase was not a question of who, but how fully the evidence would hold when the narrative faced its final test. Daniel Price was arrested without incident on a quiet morning that mirrored the restraint of the crime itself. He answered the door fully dressed, as if he had been expecting the moment. In his pocket was his phone, wiped clean of recent location data, and on his kitchen counter sat a laptop open to a blank document. There was no attempt to flee, no visible surprise. The posture fit the pattern investigators had already traced, a man accustomed to managing risk rather than reacting to it. The interrogation added no drama to the record. Price did not confess, nor did he deny the core facts in a way that invited belief. He acknowledged retrieving the encrypted drive, but claimed Marissa Cole had been alive when he left. That version failed quickly under reconstruction. The sequence inside the house, the injury pattern, and the timing of the security system all contradicted his account. Forensic analysis placed him in the office at the moment of death, his glove torn when it caught beneath the desk as he struck her from behind. The prosecution built its case carefully, knowing the defense would lean on the absence of witnesses and the circumstantial nature of motive. They presented the evidence as a closed loop rather than a chain. The traffic camera footage established movement. The glove fragment and vehicle contents established contact. The encrypted drive established motive and intent. The safe logs established premeditation. Together they formed a narrative that did not require speculation. At trial, the most damaging evidence came not from the crime scene, but from the financial records. Analysts demonstrated how Price had positioned himself as an intermediary, ensuring audits never penetrated deeply enough to expose the fraud. Marissa's work threatened that balance. Her final file showed a clear path from irregularity to accountability, one that would have ended his career and likely resulted in criminal charges. The killing, the prosecution argued, was not an act of passion, but of calculation, executed when the cost of exposure outweighed the risk of violence in his mind. The jury returned a guilty verdict after deliberating for less than 2 days. Price was sentenced to life without parole, the court emphasizing the deliberate nature of the act and the abuse of professional trust. There was no extended statement from him, no public reckoning. The case closed as it had unfolded, with restraint. In the months that followed, the company cooperated with regulators. Several executives resigned. Policies were rewritten, audits expanded, and the fraud scheme dismantled fully. These developments were recorded in filings and press releases, but they remained peripheral to the central loss. Marissa Cole's role in exposing the misconduct was acknowledged briefly, often in language that emphasized systems rather than the person who had forced them into the light. The house in the foothills sold the following year. The new owners repainted the office and replaced the carpet. The desert outside continued its slow cycles, indifferent to what had occurred within the walls. The garage door no longer stuck halfway when raised. The case file ended with a simple summary. Marissa Cole had been killed because she refused to look away from what she found. The person responsible had believed precision and planning would protect him, that a clean act carried out early in the day would dissolve into routine. Instead, the same discipline that defined Marissa's work ensured that the truth, once documented, could not be erased, only delayed. Now, let's get into the next story for tonight. The missing person report began with a timestamp that felt too precise to be comforting. At 6:42 a.m., a city employee scanning overnight parking violations noticed a blue sedan angled wrong along West 3rd Street, its nose close to the curb, its rear still breathing traffic. The street was quiet, the lake air cold and metallic. Inside the car, the driver's seat was pushed back farther than expected, as if the last person to sit there had needed space to think. The car belonged to Nathan Miller, 32, a civil engineering technician who had moved to Duluth 5 years earlier for work tied to shoreline reinforcement. His life fit the outlines of the city. He rented a modest duplex on a hill that tilted toward the water, ran the lake walk on weekends, and spent weekdays reading stress reports and soil data. He had no criminal record, no known enemies, and no history of vanishing acts. The car's location did not make sense for someone with a predictable routine. Officers photographed the vehicle as it sat, doors locked, windows closed. The gas tank was just under half. A thermos rested in the cup holder, still warm enough to suggest it had been filled within the hour. On the passenger seat lay a folded plat map, marked with faint pencil lines that followed an unfinished drainage project south of downtown. It was the kind of map Nathan handled daily, the kind that could be forgotten in a rush but rarely abandoned. By mid-morning, the lake fog lifted and the city woke fully. A patrol unit checked the duplex. Nathan's front door was locked, the bed neatly made, the bathroom sink dry. His phone charger was plugged in but empty. His laptop remained on the kitchen table, lid closed, a sticky note placed on top with a reminder about a meeting later that week. The refrigerator held groceries that would spoil if no one returned. There were no signs of a struggle, no sudden rupture. Absence had arrived cleanly. Friends and coworkers described Nathan as methodical, not secretive. He tracked his runs, balanced his accounts monthly, and filed permits early. Psychological profiles built from routine often fail at the edges, but nothing suggested a desire to escape or erase. Investigators noted a recent promotion that had brought longer hours and a narrower margin for error. Stress can compress a person's field of vision, but it rarely convinces them to step out of their life without preparation. The last verified sighting came from a convenience store camera 2 nights earlier. Nathan entered at 9:11 p.m., bought coffee and a protein bar, and left within 3 minutes. He wore a light jacket, unsuitable for the dropping temperature, but common for someone moving between car and home. His expression, captured briefly in profile, appeared neutral, neither hurried nor distracted. The footage offered no hint of an impending disappearance, only the ordinariness that often precedes one. Search teams canvassed the blocks between the parked car and the shoreline. The terrain fell away sharply in places, staircases cutting through trees toward the water. Volunteers checked brush and culverts, places where a misstep could end the night. Nothing surfaced. No clothing, no phone, no sign that a body had entered the lake. Sonar would come later, methodical and slow, but the first day yielded only the pressure of unanswered questions. Investigators returned to the map found in the car. The penciled lines matched a site visit scheduled for the following week, not an emergency. The marks were light, tentative, as if Nathan had been thinking aloud with graphite. The project area lay miles from where the car was found. It suggested thought, not impulse, planning without urgency. That contradiction began to shape the case. By dusk, the temperature dropped, and the city quieted again. The blue sedan remained where it had been found, a placeholder for a man who had not returned to claim it. The lake reflected the first lights along the shore, steady and indifferent. Somewhere between the routines that defined Nathan Miller and the spaces that had opened around him, a decision or an interruption had occurred. The question pressing the investigation was not where he had gone, but when the path of his day had bent away from everything that made sense. The second day of the search brought structure, and with it a narrowing of hope. Crews divided the city into sectors, assigning foot teams to stairways and ravines that spilled toward the lake. Boats moved along the breakwater at measured intervals, while sonar technicians traced clean lines across dark water. The absence of debris or disturbance suggested that if Nathan Miller had entered the lake, he had done so deliberately or with a precision that left little trace. Neither possibility sat easily with those who knew his habits. Investigators turned to digital residue. Nathan's phone last pinged a tower near his duplex at 8:54 p.m. the night he vanished, then went silent. There were no late-night messages, no ride requests, no unexplained app activity. His bank records showed nothing unusual. The coffee purchase matched the convenience store footage, then nothing. In cases like this, silence can be louder than evidence. It suggested either a sudden loss of access or a choice to disconnect that did not align with his character. Attention shifted to his work. The drainage project marked on the map ran near the upper reaches of the St. Louis River, an area of mixed industrial land and marsh. Colleagues described recent site visits as routine, though one noted Nathan had asked about older culvert diagrams not typically needed at that stage. It was the kind of curiosity common to engineers who prefer to understand a system's history, but it raised the question of whether he had planned an unscheduled visit. Search teams expanded inland, checking access roads and service paths near the river. The ground was soft in places, holding impressions clearly. No tire tracks matched Nathan's car. No footprints led away from a road into the reeds. The landscape absorbed sound and light, an environment that could hide activity without revealing it. Yet the absence persisted, stubborn and unhelpful. A neighbor provided a detail that shifted the timeline. She recalled seeing Nathan return home later than usual the night he disappeared, sometime after 9:30 p.m. The observation was casual, remembered only after investigators knocked. If accurate, it suggested he had reached his duplex after the convenience store stop. Inside his home, however, nothing indicated a brief return. The thermostat settings were unchanged, the lights off, the bed undisturbed. Investigators considered whether memory had filled a gap with assumption, a common human reflex under stress. The car's position continued to trouble the team. Parked improperly, it risked a ticket, something Nathan would normally avoid. The engine showed no signs of overheating or mechanical failure. It appeared to have been left quickly, as if the driver intended to return. The keys were missing. No one reported seeing a man walking alone nearby that night, though the hour and the cold thinned witnesses. Psychologically, the case resisted easy framing. Voluntary disappearance usually carries preparation or motive. Accidental death often leaves physical clues. Foul play demands opportunity and contact, neither of which had surfaced. Investigators cataloged potential stressors, including work deadlines and a recent end to a brief relationship, but none rose above the background noise of adult life. Nathan's routine suggested continuity, not rupture. By the end of the week, search efforts scaled back. The lake gave nothing. The riverbanks remained quiet. Flyers appeared in coffee shops and bus shelters, his face rendered in neutral light, eyes steady, expression unreadable. Tips came in, each one logged and cleared. A man resembling Nathan seen on a trail turned out to be a tourist. A reported sighting near a shelter was a misunderstanding. What remained was the map, the misplaced car, and a timeline with a small, dangerous gap, somewhere between the convenience store and the improperly parked sedan. Nathan Miller's night had diverged. Whether that divergence was chosen or forced, brief or catastrophic, remained hidden. The investigation pressed forward, but the city had begun to settle into a new rhythm, one that made room for a missing man without explaining him. As winter tightened its grip, the investigation shifted from movement to pattern. Detectives began reconstructing Nathan Miller's weeks rather than his last night, looking for deviations too small to notice at first glance. His work logs showed longer site visits, sometimes ending after dusk. Emails revealed questions about load tolerances and runoff flow that exceeded the scope of his assignment. None of it was alarming, but together it suggested a mind circling a problem that would not resolve. The drainage project re-entered focus, not as a location, but as an idea. Engineers who reviewed Nathan's notes observed that his pencil marks clustered around older infrastructure, sections built decades earlier with incomplete records. Failures in such systems rarely announce themselves. They wait, eroding quietly until pressure finds a weak point. Investigators wondered whether Nathan had uncovered something that demanded attention outside official channels, something that required seeing with his own eyes. A break came from an unlikely place. A traffic camera several blocks from the parked sedan captured a brief sequence minutes before the estimated time of abandonment. A figure crossed the street toward the hillside stairways, moving quickly but not running. The image was grainy, the face indistinct, but the jacket matched the one Nathan wore in the convenience store footage. The direction mattered more than the certainty. It suggested he had left the car intentionally and on foot. Search teams returned to the stairways, now glazed with ice. Below them lay a maze of informal paths used by locals, shortcuts that bypassed streets and lights. Volunteers combed the area again, this time widening their scope to include abandoned sheds and service entrances tucked into the slope. In one culvert, they found a scuffed patch of concrete and a broken pencil, the same brand Nathan used at work. The find was inconclusive, but it tethered the search to something physical at last. The culvert fed into a network that eventually drained toward the river. Maintenance records showed sporadic inspections and deferred repairs. If Nathan had entered the system, whether to inspect or to follow a problem, the environment would have been hostile. Low temperatures, standing water, and narrow passages could disorient even an experienced technician. Yet there was still no sign of a fall or collapse that would explain a sudden end. Investigators consulted behavioral analysts, who cautioned against overfitting the evidence. People do not always act according to training under stress. Curiosity can override caution, especially when paired with a sense of responsibility. Nathan's colleagues described him as someone who fixed things quietly, preferring resolution to recognition. That trait, admirable in routine contexts, can become dangerous when systems are unforgiving. Public attention waned as weeks passed. Tips slowed, then stopped. The case file thickened with maps, photographs, and transcripts that circled the same questions. Why leave the car where it would draw notice? Why carry a work map but not a phone? Why step into darkness without telling anyone? Each answer proposed by investigators solved one problem while creating another. Late in the season, a maintenance crew reported an obstruction deep in the drainage network, a partial collapse that had altered water flow. Access was limited, and safety assessments delayed entry. The location aligned with Nathan's penciled notes. It was not proof, but it was proximity. The investigation paused there, balanced between anticipation and restraint, waiting for conditions to allow a closer look. By the time spring approached, the city had learned to live with the unanswered. Nathan Miller's absence settled into a quiet ache, marked by empty routines and an unresolved file. Investigators stood at the edge of a system that resisted easy entry, aware that whatever lay inside might finally explain the careful man who stepped away from his car and into the cold. or might deepen the mystery beyond recovery. Access to the damaged section of the drainage network came in late April, when the last of the ice released its hold. Engineers stabilized the entry points and lowered lighting into the culvert, revealing a narrow passage that bent sharply before dropping toward the river. The collapse reported by the maintenance crew proved smaller than feared, but significant enough to alter flow patterns. It had been caused by a corroded joint, hidden behind layers of sediment, the kind of failure that develops slowly and reveals itself only when pressure shifts. Investigators entered with the engineers, moving carefully through standing water and debris. About 40 yards in, they found a backpack pinned against a grate, its fabric darkened by weeks of saturation. Inside were a notebook, a flashlight with depleted batteries, and a folded Platt map marked with the same faint pencil lines found in Nathan Miller's car. The notebook contained measurements and sketches that matched the damaged joint, along with calculations that suggested he had been tracing an undocumented modification to the system. Farther along, where the passage narrowed, they found his phone, screen cracked, lodged between rocks. It showed no outgoing calls after the night he vanished. The placement suggested a drop rather than disposal. The final discovery came beyond the bend, where the ceiling dipped low enough to force a crouch. There, against the wall, lay Nathan's jacket, and beneath it, his body, partially shielded from the main flow by the curve of the tunnel. The medical examiner's findings were consistent and restrained. Nathan had suffered a head injury consistent with a fall, likely caused by slipping on wet concrete. Disorientation and hypothermia followed quickly in the cold, confined space. There was no evidence of assault or restraint. Death would have occurred within hours, before search efforts reached the area above. The reconstruction that followed aligned the fragments of the case into a single sequence. After returning home briefly, Nathan had gone back out, carrying his map and tools. He had parked quickly near the stairways to access the culvert network he had been studying, intending a short inspection. His training and curiosity had drawn him to an undocumented flaw he believed posed a risk during spring runoff. Inside the system, a misstep had ended the night. The improperly parked car, the missing phone, the pencil marks, all resolved into elements of a decision made without drama. Nathan had not been fleeing or summoned. He had been acting within a pattern familiar to him, one shaped by responsibility and confidence in his own competence. The system he entered offered no margin for error. The city moved quickly to repair the joint and audit similar sections, work completed without public emphasis on its origin. Nathan's family received the findings in a private briefing, the clarity offering a measure of closure without comfort. There were no lingering questions of intent or threat, only the understanding that a routine impulse, followed to its end, had intersected with an unforgiving environment. When the case file closed, it did so without ceremony. Nathan Miller had not disappeared into the unknown. He had stepped into a hidden space beneath the city he worked to protect, and there his life had ended. The explanation fit the evidence precisely, leaving no mystery behind, only the quiet certainty of how a careful man met a moment that allowed no correction. Now let's begin the final story tonight. The cabin sat quietly among the pines, its windows dark against the Montana wilderness. Inside, a man worked alone by lamplight, surrounded by hand tools, scraps of metal, and pages of tightly written notes. He lived without electricity, without running water, and without neighbors close enough to notice the rhythm of his days. From the outside there was nothing remarkable about the place. It looked like a retreat. It looked like solitude. What it concealed was one of the longest and most unsettling criminal investigations in American history. For nearly 2 decades, a series of carefully constructed bombs appeared without warning. They arrived in the mail or waited silently inside packages that seemed ordinary until the moment they were opened. Each device was different, but they shared a signature precision. The components were handmade. The wiring was meticulous. The explosions were not random acts of rage. They were messages. The first blast injured a university professor. The second wounded a graduate student. In the years that followed, secretaries, airline executives, computer scientists, and store owners would all become targets. Some survived with life-altering injuries. Others did not survive at all. The attacker never spoke publicly at first, but his intent became increasingly clear. He was waging a private war against modern society. Investigators quickly realized they were not dealing with a single impulsive criminal. This was someone patient, intelligent, and disciplined. The bombs were constructed from common materials, yet assembled in ways that avoided easy tracing. There were no fingerprints. There were no fibers that led anywhere. Every device was designed to destroy itself as thoroughly as possible, leaving behind only fragments and questions. Meanwhile, fear spread quietly through academic institutions and corporate offices. Packages were handled more carefully. Mailrooms were placed on alert. People began to notice the smallest irregularities. A return address that felt wrong. A box that seemed heavier than expected. The attacks were infrequent enough to avoid constant panic, but regular enough to ensure they were never forgotten. As years passed, the investigation grew massive. Federal agents cataloged every component, every screw, every shard of metal recovered from the scenes. Patterns emerged, but answers did not. The bomber appeared to favor individuals connected to technology and industry, yet his choices were inconsistent enough to defy simple profiling. He struck across multiple states, often with years between attacks, suggesting someone who could wait indefinitely for the right moment. The media gave him a name, one that reduced a complex threat to a grim shorthand. UNABOM, short for University and Airline Bomber. It was never a name he chose, but it followed him everywhere. Behind it was a person who seemed to exist only through destruction, a ghost who left no trail beyond his work. Inside the investigation, frustration mounted. Hundreds of suspects were examined and discarded. Thousands of tips flooded in after every attack. Some were thoughtful. Many were desperate. None led to an arrest. The bomber appeared to live outside the modern systems that tracked most people. He left no financial records tied to the crimes. He did not use vehicles that could be traced. He did not communicate except through explosions. Then, after years of silence, something changed. A letter arrived. It was not a confession, but it was a declaration. The bomber claimed responsibility for the attacks and offered an explanation for his actions. He described a world corrupted by technology, where human freedom was being slowly erased by machines and institutions. He wrote with clarity and control, constructing arguments rather than threats. For investigators, the letter was both a breakthrough and a new challenge. For the first time, they were hearing his voice. Soon, more letters followed. Each one revealed more about how he saw the world and himself. He was not hiding his intelligence. He wanted it recognized. He believed his ideas mattered more than his anonymity, and that belief would alter the course of the case. Federal agents now faced a difficult decision. Publishing the bomber's words risked amplifying his message, but it also offered something they had never had before. Language leaves traces. Writing reflects thought patterns, education, and personality. Somewhere, someone might recognize the voice behind the violence. As the investigation entered this new phase, the man in the woods continued his work, unaware of how close the distance between himself and the outside world was about to become. The quiet that had protected him for so long was beginning to fracture, not with an explosion, but with words. And in those words, investigators believed, was the key to finally seeing him clearly. The decision to publish the bomber's writing was not made lightly. Investigators understood the risk of giving a mass attacker exactly what he wanted: attention and validation. Yet the case had stalled for years, and the letters represented the first meaningful lead that did not rely on fragments of metal or burned wiring. Language, unlike explosives, could be traced backward to a mind. When the manifesto appeared in major newspapers, millions of people read it. Some dismissed it as incoherent extremism. Others found parts of it unsettlingly articulate. The bomber argued that modern technology was not liberating humanity, but enslaving it. He claimed industrial society stripped individuals of autonomy and replaced purpose with artificial systems of control. The writing was dense, methodical, and emotionally restrained. There was no rambling. There was no obvious mental disorganization. Whoever wrote it was educated and deliberate. Inside the task force, analysts began dissecting the text line by line. Linguists examined sentence structure, vocabulary choices, and recurring phrases. Psychologists studied the emotional tone, noting the absence of impulsive rage. This was not a man lashing out blindly. This was someone who believed himself justified, even necessary. One detail stood out quickly. The writing style felt dated, as though it belonged to an earlier academic era. Certain phrases were unusual, formal in ways that had fallen out of fashion. The arguments echoed themes from mid-20th century critiques of technology, but they were presented with original phrasing rather than borrowed quotes. This suggested someone who had absorbed these ideas deeply, perhaps long ago, and had been refining them in isolation. Meanwhile, the public response was overwhelming. Thousands of tips poured in from people who thought they recognized the voice behind the words. Former students remembered professors who spoke in similar terms. Colleagues recalled co-workers who ranted about technology with comparable intensity. Family members wondered whether a distant relative's long-held beliefs had crossed into something darker. Each tip had to be evaluated, documented, and often dismissed. At the same time, the bomber continued to exist as a physical threat. Although the letters created a pause in attacks, there was no guarantee the violence had ended. Investigators had to balance analysis with readiness, knowing another device could appear without warning. As the linguistic work progressed, patterns became clearer. The author frequently used specific constructions, pairing words in ways that were statistically rare. He avoided contractions almost entirely. He favored certain transitions and qualifiers, repeating them across hundreds of pages. This consistency suggested not only education, but habit. Writing like this had once been routine for him. One analyst proposed a crucial shift in perspective. Instead of asking who might write like this now, they should ask who once wrote like this professionally, but no longer did. Someone who had stepped away from academia or formal work, yet retained the voice of that world. This idea reframed the search. Investigators began looking at former professors, researchers, and graduate students who had vanished from professional circles years earlier. Men who had withdrawn, retreated, or been dismissed. Individuals whose lives had taken sharp turns away from institutions and into isolation. Slowly, the list narrowed. Among the thousands of tips, one stood out for its specificity. It did not come from a profiler or a colleague, but from someone who had lived with the writing style for years. The tip described a man who shared not only the bomber's ideas, but his phrasing. Certain expressions in the manifesto were nearly identical to things this person had written decades earlier. Agents approached the tip cautiously. Many promising leads had collapsed under scrutiny. Still, they gathered the older writings mentioned in the report and placed them side by side with the manifesto. What they saw made the room go quiet. The similarities were not vague or interpretive. They were structural. Entire argument patterns mirrored each other. Even small grammatical quirks aligned in ways that were difficult to explain by coincidence. Linguists ran formal comparisons, and the results reinforced what their instincts already suspected. For the first time in the investigation, the bomber no longer felt like a faceless idea. He felt like a specific individual with a past, a trajectory, and a place in the world. Agents began retracing that path, moving backward through years of absence and silence. They followed records that had not been examined before, searching for where a mind like this might have gone when it decided to disappear. Somewhere far from the offices and labs he once knew, a man continued to live quietly among the trees. He still believed he was unheard, still believed his message was misunderstood. He did not yet know that his own words had built a bridge investigators could finally cross. And once they stepped onto it, there would be no turning back. Once investigators had a name, the case changed shape. It was no longer an abstract hunt for an unseen bomber, but a focused effort to confirm whether one reclusive life could account for nearly 2 decades of violence. Still, certainty mattered. A mistake at this stage would not only derail the investigation, but risk allowing the real attacker to disappear forever. Agents began reconstructing the suspect's history in careful detail. Years earlier, he had shown exceptional intellectual promise. He moved easily through elite academic institutions, earning respect for his mathematical brilliance while remaining socially distant from those around him. Former colleagues described him as intense and private, someone who rejected small talk and seemed uncomfortable with ordinary human interaction. Even then, he was known for rigid beliefs and an uncompromising worldview. At some point, that promising path fractured. He resigned abruptly from his academic position, leaving behind a career many would have considered extraordinary. There was no clear professional explanation, only a growing resentment toward institutions and authority. Afterward, his footprint faded. He withdrew from cities, from universities, from the systems that had once validated him. The world he rejected did not notice his absence. Investigators traced him through sparse records. He did not maintain steady employment. He did not build a family. He did not remain connected to colleagues. Instead, he moved steadily toward isolation, eventually settling in a remote area far from the reach of routine observation. The location was not random. It allowed privacy, self-sufficiency, and distance from the society he despised. As agents studied his life, the crimes began to align with chilling coherence. The targets matched his grievances. The timing of attacks corresponded with periods when he would have had the freedom and solitude to work undetected. The sophistication of the devices matched his technical aptitude and patience. Even the evolution of the bombs reflected a mind that refined its methods through experience rather than improvisation. Still, the task force resisted the temptation to rush. No arrest could be made on ideology alone. They needed physical confirmation, evidence that tied this man to the devices beyond belief and language. Surveillance began quietly. Agents traveled to the region where he lived, careful not to disturb the isolation that had shielded him for years. They studied maps and aerial imagery. They noted the lack of utilities, the absence of modern conveniences. Everything about the setting reinforced what they had learned about his worldview. This was not a temporary retreat. It was a deliberate rejection of the modern world. What concerned investigators most was what might be inside the cabin. Based on the bombs that had been recovered, they believed he would keep detailed notes. The devices were too precise to be assembled without planning. He likely documented his work, recorded his thoughts, refined his arguments. If those materials existed, they could confirm everything. At the same time, the risk remained high. If he sensed attention, He could destroy evidence or disappear deeper into the wilderness. Worse, he could resume bombing. Every move had to be calculated. Back at headquarters, analysts continued to compare writings. They examined letters, essays, and fragments of correspondence spanning decades. The match grew stronger with each comparison. Even punctuation habits aligned. The case was no longer built on a single similarity, but on a constellation of traits that pointed to the same source. As pressure mounted, agents debated timing. They needed enough evidence to justify a search and potential arrest. But they also understood the danger of waiting too long. The suspect was intelligent, methodical, and capable of violence. Underestimating him had already cost lives. The investigation reached a delicate balance between patience and urgency. Surveillance teams watched quietly. Analysts worked relentlessly. Warrants were drafted and revised. Every detail was reviewed, knowing that once they acted, there would be no opportunity to correct a mistake. Unaware of the tightening net, the man in the cabin continued his routines. He wrote. He repaired tools. He believed his solitude was intact. For years, isolation had protected him from scrutiny. Now that same isolation meant there would be no one to warn him. The distance between the bomber and those pursuing him had narrowed to a matter of miles. The next step would bring them face to face for the first time. And when it did, the silence he had relied on would finally come to an end. The arrest came quietly, without spectacle or resistance. Federal agents approached the cabin with caution, aware that the man inside had spent years building weapons designed to kill without warning. They did not know what traps might be waiting or what devices could be hidden among the trees. Every step was deliberate. Every movement assumed danger. When they reached him, there was no dramatic confrontation. He was taken into custody calmly, almost passively, as though the moment he had spent years imagining had finally arrived and required no reaction at all. The man who had terrorized the country through carefully disguised packages did not flee or fight. He complied. Inside the cabin, investigators found what they had feared and hoped for at the same time. The space was small and spare, lit by natural light and organized with a precision that mirrored the bombs themselves. On a crude desk were handwritten journals. There were thousands of pages, some detailed philosophical arguments against industrial society. Others described the construction of explosive devices in meticulous detail. Diagrams matched fragments recovered from past crime scenes. Components were stored carefully. Tools bore traces of materials used in previous attacks. It was all there. The journals confirmed not only authorship, but intent. He had documented his crimes with the same detached clarity he used in his writing. There was no remorse expressed. He viewed the bombings as a necessary means to force society to confront what he believed was an existential threat. The victims were not individuals to him. They were symbols. As agents cataloged the evidence, the full scope of the case became undeniable. Years of unanswered questions now had a single, coherent explanation. The isolation, the patience, the intellectual rigor. All of it converged in that one place, far from the world he despised yet deeply shaped by it. During questioning, he spoke carefully and sparingly. He did not deny responsibility. He did not seek forgiveness. His focus remained fixed on his ideas, insisting that history would eventually understand his actions. Investigators noted the same controlled tone they had seen in his letters. The man they arrested was the same voice that had written the manifesto, unchanged by exposure or consequence. For the families of the victims, the arrest brought a complex kind of closure. The fear that had lingered for years finally had an ending, but the damage could not be undone. Lives had been lost. Others had been permanently altered. Knowing who was responsible did not erase that pain, but it did end the uncertainty. The case that had once seemed unsolvable now stood fully revealed. The bomber was not a network, not a conspiracy, not a shadowy organization. He was a single individual who had chosen isolation over connection and ideology over human life. His intelligence, once recognized as extraordinary, had been turned inward until it hardened into justification for violence. In the end, what stopped him was not technology or surveillance, but language. His need to be heard, to explain himself, had given investigators the one thing they needed. Words, unlike bombs, could be traced. They carried the imprint of a mind that could not fully hide itself. The cabin in the woods returned to silence after the search teams left. The investigation that had spanned nearly 2 decades was over. The threat that had moved unseen through the mail system was gone. And with his capture, the long, quiet terror that had unfolded one package at a time finally came to an end.